because you've got them on the hook, you've got them in the door, they've probably had an incredible experience. Let's work a little harder at getting a second date.
The thing that is always shocking and surprising to my colleagues is that half of our audience is our first-time buyers.
It's the hole at the bottom of the bucket.
Welcome back to Leading the Way, a series designed for arts and cultural leaders, helping you focus on the strategies and actions that turn relationships into revenue. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, and visit the link in the description below for more insights. Today, this is the first part of our discussion around the key transactional behaviours that we see making up arts and cultural databases: advocates, buyers, and triers. In this episode, we're diving into the largest group, triers. Okay, so we're going to dig into our first behavioural segment of our databases. We call them triers. For folks listening, what is one fact that each of you would have about triers that we typically see in every database?
The first is that it is the lion's share of the data set. Every time that number starts with a 9, it's always more than 90% of every database we study, no matter the region, no matter the business model.
Yeah, and the vast majority of those 90% are folks who were one and done. They were first-timers who came one time and then never came back.
And there's a big opportunity to invite them back. This is a big part of our database, so even a small change can have a big impact from a revenue perspective.
So triers, are they there by chance, or have we created a system by which 90% of our databases are made up of these?
Created a system. I think we have a reality. These are folks who are moving from first time to second, or from last time to now. They've lapsed, and that's the reality. I think we don't have in our field enough of a focus on retention. Never have. Certainly that's the case now. So tightening, being aware, and then tightening the systems around the invitation back is the most important step that can be taken with this group, I think.
Yeah, this is an expensive group. This is an expensive part of our audience to acquire, and it can feel really expensive and labor intensive to re-engage or retain them. And oftentimes this is where organizations have fallen short in how they're allocating expense and resource towards particular parts of the database. This is an easy part to just be okay with, continuing on business as usual when it comes to how we're setting marketing budgets and marketing activity, kind of accepting the behavior of triers. And I think our challenge would be that there's an opportunity here to challenge that, to not accept the levels of churn that you would see from the triers.
Quite literally, the visual that we use is of bricks that are not tight. Like there's lots of gaps in the bricks in triers, lots of falling down, falling south. And especially if your organization's triers deliver a lot of revenue, and some do, depending on the business model, depending on the region, then it's easier to say, we got a lot of them and they're delivering a lot of income.
I want to talk about the regional differences in a moment, but Brad, I wonder, you talked about the reality of the people that exist in triers. Why is it so critical that we focus attention there when those folks, they're not visiting very frequently and we're getting new people every year? So surely that's okay if we're refilling that section?
It's kind of okay. There's always going to be a need for new. We are always going to need to have new relationships coming into our organization. That's not going away. The question becomes, where is reliable, repeatable, sustainable revenue going to come for your business in the future? And it is going to come from your ability to convert triers into buyers and into advocates. This upwardly northerly movement of identifying which triers are going to become more frequent and more valuable to your organization is how you will get higher ROI on the time and money that your team is investing in those relationships, as well as develop this repeatable base of revenue that's going to support your organization into the future. The risk of over-reliance upon triers is heavy reliance upon programmatic risk, needing to take big swings on blockbusters to keep finding the stuff that's going to attract these kinds of first timers. That comes at a pretty big financial cost, oftentimes at pretty low margins for organizations as well. Those shows are expensive. Yes, they attract a lot of folks, but the net revenue often isn't great. There's knock-on effects to having a business model that is overly reliant and caters to trier relationships versus business models that are oriented towards welcoming people in at that part of the pyramid, so to speak, and then consciously inviting them up.
Yeah, well said.
But that invitation costs money. The triers typically spend less. They have the lowest annual household revenue, and the marketing expense to enable that invitation and move them up is really significant.
It is. It's a heavy lift, but it's a heavy lift to bring new buyers in for every single performance. And that's what we're doing today. We're spending a lot. To Brad's point, it's expensive to acquire new buyers. And these people that have attended once or that have been before and haven't been back for a while, these are gold to our organization. And they are the first people that we should be reaching to. And there are ways to do that can help us increase the likelihood that they will move up and come back more recently and spend a little bit more. And that's really, really going to help us with reducing the amount of money that it takes to keep people and get them to be more active over time.
I think it's really important. I want to reinforce this because I know we talked about this in the introduction to explaining advocates, buyers, and triers, but I really want to reinforce how important it is to not be thinking about these relationships through any particular transaction type, right? We are talking about triers, but within triers, we are talking about people who have, yes, ticket buying behavior. They may have subscription buying behavior. They may even have donation behavior, but there is the combination of these three that are indicating a lack of consistency, a lack of frequency, relatively low value within your database compared to others. And I think what's important here, this shift away from just talking about and defining our relationships through a single transaction type is important to holistically understanding who we are in business with and who our relationships are with. And that we're not just defining people by transaction types, but we're able to look at them holistically. And even within triers, you'll have these mixtures of behavior within the trier part.
Well, and some of those behaviors are signals as well about the potential for somebody wanting to have a deeper relationship with us. In the UK, there's membership that people might buy to get early access to a particular show, or they may make a roundup donation at the end of the booking. And they might they be signals, flares to say, I'm quite interested in perhaps having a deeper relationship with this organization.
I think there are behavioral signals, but this context that Brad just offered is really important. The framework that TRG long ago introduced in arts and culture around advocates, buyers, and triers is very common in business. And it's based not on specific labels. Subscribers are here, members are there, while those are flares and signals for sure. It is based on how recent a customer is, how frequent a customer is, their monetary or financial investment, and their annual growth or stability at the very, very least, because we like to say that you can balance a budget with a one-hit wonder. And we have seen in these models $1 million gift, a household with $1 million gift, actually not showing up at the top of the pool. But because of their lack of frequency, while you can have an annual impact in the whole context of the whole database, that household is not engaged with enough dependable behavior to fuel sustainable and recurring revenue. So I really appreciate what you described. Triers are there's a complicated set of behaviors in each of these groups. But to answer your question, yeah, there are signals that have at the trier level so much to do with recency, which is something we've just recently talked about.
So let's talk about the regional differences. You alluded to that earlier. Are triers the same in the US, the same in Canada, the same in the UK? Is the emphasis and reliance on triers different in those regions? What do we see?
Absolutely is. In the UK, and Brad, you'll add to this, but in the UK, the reliance on the single ticket buyer as compared to the subscriber, which is something that had been a thing here and we see with far less frequency now. Membership and other kinds of programs help create what we would call buyers. But in the UK, triers represent an enormous proportion of the data set that we typically see, whereas in the US, where there's more of those loyalty programs, we see a slightly less reliance on that trier.
Yeah, there's a difference there's less of a difference in the volume or the proportion of triers in the UK versus North America. Similar proportions, often upwards of 95%. The big difference comes in the revenue impact that they have. In North America, because of the things you've talked about, the other kind of loyalty mechanisms that are pretty well in place around subscription and multi-buying and individual philanthropy, means that triers are oftentimes 30, maybe 35% of the revenue, even though they are 90% of the database. Whereas in the UK, where there are fewer examples of those powerful loyalty models in place, it's oftentimes 80% of the revenue and 90% of the volume in the database. A big difference. That top part of the pyramid between buyers and advocates is so much not only smaller in volume but smaller in the revenue impact. That does have business model implications in the various regions where there's both opportunity in North America to look for where that heavy reliance upon the revenue that's going to have to come from buyers and advocates. There's the opportunity to look for where that's going to come from within triers. And in the UK, there is the opportunity to build basically the top of the pyramid for many organizations in the UK through membership schemes or multi-buying schemes or introducing more structured, rigorous individual philanthropy.
It's part of the risk when we first started working in the UK that we saw. This was around 2015, and we applied these models here and went, oh my gosh, look at this reliance, this revenue reliance on these not sticky, not frequent, and why? And there are different reasons, funding models and experiences, and yet the provocation that we're making with more frequency now is what are those tactics that can actually drive this high proportion of triers north?
Yeah, and it's really about, again, I come back to always relationships and our communication with people and our making them feel like we know who they are and we care, that they come back and join us, that we love their company, we want them to return, whether they've been once or several times, or they're subscribers that are at a certain level that haven't maybe been back for a while or that are just starting out. It's that personal invitation, that personal and well-timed request to come back to see us that is going to help us build that.
And the incentives
behavior
for them to do it,
Yes.
the ways that we create reasons why and rationale to buy 2 instead of 1, buy 3 instead of 1.
Right, that combination of demand and that loyalty structure and how we're using pricing and value and experience to bring people back.
Yeah.
A critical component of triers is this reliance on new audiences and first-time attendees. And at risk of bringing up the pandemic again, there is a reality that we're seeing again in first-timer retention, that it's now got worse.
Right. If one can imagine.
Right. So often that data point that 75-85% of first timers never come back again is a shocking statistic, and it feels like one that seems never to be taken seriously and truly addressed. How critical is it to focus on first timer retention?
It's the hole at the bottom of the bucket. If we don't take the long view on this part of the way we run our business, the water just keeps flowing out and we can't get ahead. So the challenge is that when you've got lots of pressures on the marketing team, the box office team, lots of changes and updates to our websites, those are really the three places where triers are engaging, then making the investment in first-time buyer invitation is expensive, and it moves the needle a little at a time. It's incremental, but it is so critical.
It's essential to lifting up the household value of triers and moving them into buyers. And it is essential to maximize the significant investment that organizations are making to just get them in the door the first time. As Christina was saying, there's massive amounts of energy and money being spent to get them into the door the first time. And then through our behavior, oftentimes not consciously within organizations, we then just start that cycle over again. We let that investment just kind of fizzle out, and we decide to throw fresh money and focus fresh money and fresh energy into starting that cycle again, rather than building upon the momentum and the investment to get them in the door the first time, and then caring a lot about getting them the second time because we understand what the multi-year impacts are going to be. We seem to be okay with that in a way that boggles the mind sometimes, and sometimes it just makes you want to grab them by the shoulders and just say, hey, wake up. You are spending lots of time and money to get them in the door, and then your attention goes somewhere else. Can we stay focused on that relationship? Because you've got them on the hook, you've got them in the door. They've probably had an incredible experience. Let's work a little harder at getting a second date.
Yes, and what I would say is that every time I've gone into an organization, whether as a consultant or as a marketing director, the thing that is always shocking and surprising to my colleagues is that half of our audience is our first-time buyers. Right. And 75 to 80% of those people don't return. And we just think, of course they had a great time, of course they're coming back, but we're not measuring that data on the day-to-day. We don't know that that's happening. And just shining a light on that, and then knowing that we can and should focus on bringing those people back is really critical to building our audiences and moving people up the pyramid.
Jill, I remember one of the first times I saw you speak, you presented the dating analogy, and you talked about the reality of first timers and how, and you asked the question to folks, what do we typically do and say? Yeah. And we often send a survey. and imagine going on a date and, you know, afterwards texting them and saying, can you rate my outfit on a scale of 1 to 10 or the food? And in fact, what we need to do is just invite. And I wonder, there's a really important piece of counsel that we don't see consistently be implemented that is critical to first-timer retention. That
dating analogy is something that has stuck, and I think it sticks because it helps us get in the mindset of the relationship rather than a transaction. And so, but you're right, if we go on a first date, I have to actually prepare you for that date. I have to tell you what I look like, especially if it's a blind date. We've not gone out before. I have to tell you where to park, about the pre-concert or pre-show opportunities. I have to set you up for success, not just send a affirmation that your tickets can be picked up at will call. And then maybe during the experience itself or the event itself, there's nice things that can be done to solidify the relationship, but crucially, as you've described, after our first date, if the first question is, how did I do? And you put that in the framework of a relationship, it always gets a giggle, but the practical next most important question to ask is, will you go out with me again? And we have found and tested over and over again that rather than jazz hands, the most resonant invitation is one that first reminds me about the date we were on last night or a week ago, and puts me back in that place to say, wasn't the waiter great? And that bottle of wine you chose was great. Wasn't that aria beautiful? In that moment when everybody's breath sucked in just a minute, wasn't that extraordinary? Remember that, and then the invitation. Those details matter when we're setting up a relationship, and they take time and investment and money and all of the things. And so I think it's one of the things that can be subordinated, unfortunately.
And practically, Brad, that looks like direct mail, email, in the venue. How should that be executed?
In all the ways you described, and then some, right? There can be a whole spectrum of attention and detail brought to this very important moment in a relationship. Typically, multiple channels of communication is close to coming right after the performance as possible. Direct mail, email. Some organizations have had success with just picking up the phone. That's exactly right. What we have found is that multiple channels always work better than the single channel. Even if I'm going to send you 2 emails, mixing up the channel to have multiple touch points and multiple channels works better. Direct mail has worked well. Phone has worked well. Digital can work.
Digital today, even now, you can marry your direct marketing lists to your digital campaigns. And so you can get hyper personalized with some of these tools now.
Absolutely. And everything, including the stuff Jill talked about. Retention begins at the moment of purchase. Retention does not begin after the show. Retention begins at the moment of purchase. And so thinking about that moment, from the moment they said yes to going on that date with you, that effort to get them to come back on a second one has begun. So it doesn't start when the curtain comes down. It starts with the pre-show communications. It starts with, if we can, how we welcome and acknowledge them. Maybe there's a surprise on their seat that's welcoming them there for the first time, that's inviting them to something special at the event. Then they're hearing from us immediately afterwards, hopefully by something hyper-personalized where we can, or they're seeing us in their feeds afterwards, inviting them back, perhaps with a strong offer to just make it easy to say yes to the next thing. And so I think thinking through that entire arc of the relationship for organizations that dedicate the level of thought and care and energy to that retention effort have seen the best results.
I had this really wonderful story. I was at a Broadway League conference in the States, and a marketing VP of one of the major theater companies that was a client of ours rushed me and said, Jill, we have started a task force to just ideate the ways in which we can invite and delight and get over this threshold with our first-time buyers. And she said, my husband, on our first date, already, like during dinner, had already thought of and proposed my second date. And so for us at this particular theater company, if you're new, when you sit in your seat, we already have your second date invitation on your seat card. Back then, it could be digital now or some other mechanism, but the tactic doesn't matter. We can come up with all kinds of brilliant ideas. The tactics don't matter, except for some of the mainline counsel points you have there. But coming up with and focusing on ways to surprise, delight, and engage is really the key.
Brad, you talked about offers. This is a place with triers where offers and incentives can be used strategically in the right way to change behavior. Typically, we see offers happening at the last minute because of a fire sale, because we need to sell tickets. Why is an incentive or offer crucial to encourage these folks to change their behavior?
Offers are an important factor. Think about it as cost of sale. What we have found is that the cost of sale to attract a first-time buyer back a second time, the same is true to reactivate someone, also a trier who maybe hasn't been here in a long time. It requires a higher cost of sale. And so part of that cost of sale is, of course, what we would invest in the marketing, but oftentimes what we also need to invest in that cost of sale is creating attractive price incentives to get attention and to get people thinking about and considering what that second date might be. What's really interesting about these offers, and something we've measured with many organizations, is while we may put a really strong, compelling offer, sometimes up to 50% off, in order to get a first-time buyer back again, not every person who comes back even uses that offer. In fact, sometimes it's less than 50% of the retained are doing so on a discount. The offer becomes an important way to catch their attention. It's something shiny in their email box, or it's something shiny on their seat card when they attend for the first time, that just gets them thinking and shopping and curious again. But it doesn't have to be the motivator. So the offer doesn't have to feel like we are giving away seats. And we get to structure when that offer and invitation is made. It can happen early in the sales process. It can be time bound and limited to encourage that activity earlier on in the sales process, and not training early customers or lapsed customers to just wait.
It can also be an invitation to priority access for really great seats for something that's in demand. So I'd like to invite you back to this blockbuster performance, and we're holding priority inventory, priority seating just for you, so that you will have a wonderful experience if you respond by X kind of date. So experimentation, testing, and learning is as important as anything.
Absolutely value added, especially for subscribers or people who have exhibited some loyalty and maybe are less going to be less likely to respond to a discount offer. Added value, bringing them to the Patrons Lounge one time, or something that just sparks their interest and gets them to feel like you care whether they're coming back or not.
You know, something I want to just bring to the forefront here in this discussion is that while we see the clarion call required to pay attention to triers, there are many leaders who say, you know, I'm getting great income from our single ticket buyers. I've got a great business that is growing on top line revenue or is stable, even though a large proportion of my audiences are triers. And you look at our commercial brethren, and you can say, you know, there are West End and there are Broadway shows that are making good money by selling a lot of tickets to a lot of people. The difference is these businesses run every year. There's payroll to make, there's artists to pay, there's buildings to keep up. These are businesses that require repeatable, renewable income. And I think that's the point. We have got to lead these organizations in ways where the income can be lower cost, more count-onable than what we typically see in this proportion of these inconsistent and expensive relationships.
It's an interesting comparison to the commercial side of our sector, because while the product may be very similar and in some cases exactly the same, the experience can be very similar or exactly the same. The fundamental businesses behind them are radically different.
Right.
The commercial side, those businesses are single product businesses. They're quite literally entities that only exist for the sole purpose of bringing this one show to this one theater. And now that may be the case for many years. In the case of a long run, a Six or a Lion King or something, but for the most part, they exist only as businesses to serve the single production in that single theater at its time. That's not our business. No. We compare ourselves to this. They are fundamentally not in the same business, even though the product on the stages can be very similar. And so this is an important distinction that you bring up when we continue to compare ourselves to more commercial operators just based on the programming. We are in the relationship business over time. Our business relies upon multiple products over multiple years and bringing folks to a venue to see lots of different things, not to see one particular thing at a period in time. And that's why our business models and what we can do with offers and inventory and pricing are fundamentally different.
Right.
And what's so incredible is that in our sector, there's a lot of these instances where those two worlds collide, where a non-profit venue is hosting a one-time entity tour of a show that I just need to make the money in that week. And we see that create tension in the realities about how we manage those relationships. What would you say to if you had a chief executive and a producer together in the room about this tension?
Boy, I would say there's enlightened self-interest in ensuring that both parties can win, because the producers require venues to thrive. They need to go to places where databases are active, buildings are maintained, staff is talented and capable. And the producers also need to make the money. Their businesses need to thrive too. So the enlightened self-interest of the venue is to create an environment where that can happen. And the messy middle is around the loyalists and the strategies and incentives and relationship management that the venue has, and the need to seed and create the long term with the people in their community, with the short term demands on the producer's need for return.
Who is taking often, always a significant amount of risk.
Exactly. But they don't talk to each other.
That's the
feels
thing.
like they combat each other rather than talking to each other.
Communication makes such a difference. I mean, in general, a lot of those producers that are sending shows to receiving houses, they get that subscription is a value that benefits them, and they get that group sales are a value that benefits them. So they'll allow a certain amount of discounting to accommodate those sorts of things. The first timers is perhaps a new concept, but I've had great luck in talking to those entities and explaining why we want to invite first timers back, how we use invitation and incentives to do so, and how it benefits them. And generally, almost every time, they're like, yeah, okay. And it's done early in the sales cycle, so it's not challenging when we're in high demand, the high value. And there are ways to manage it that makes everybody happy. It helps build your audience and demand so that, the invitation works with demand management.
Getting everybody happy is a trick, though.
Yeah.
I mean,
Venues that can strategically deploy their database will have a competitive advantage against their peers. This is a competitive marketplace to get the tour, to get the big show. They're competing with other venues, oftentimes in their region or not very far from them. The competitive advantage that they will have is the ability to demonstrate how they can leverage the marketing engine within their organization, which primarily driven by triers. How do we strategically leverage the marketing engine that our venue has within its database to deploy its triers to help drive volume and to drive sales in a reliable, repeatable way? So organizations that can wrap their heads around how best to leverage particular product for second dates, how best to communicate and retain triers, how to deploy triers in certain moments of a campaign cycle, how to maximize volume from triers, but how to maximize revenue from its loyalists, its buyers, and its advocates, can give a venue a competitive edge when bidding for the next big West End Broadway tour that's coming through their town. That database is powerful. And if you can harness it, you'll have an edge.
So I appreciate that dig in. There are lots of relationships here to manage when we think about how we can change the behavior of triers. To leaders listening, what is the one takeaway that you want them to hear from this conversation, this critical, almost all of their database pool of folks that need clear, disciplined attention?
Yeah, I think the first is what you've just said. It's the lion's share of the database. So being able to understand that within your own organization as a leader, know the number, make it a priority to track that number over time, and then creating a culture of incentives for staff, actually, to invest the time needed to invite these folks back and focus on retention.
Yeah, I would challenge leaders to think really critically about the ROI of their team's time and of the marketing resources that are going to activity that is concentrated on either acquiring, retaining, or reactivating triers. Really examine, are we spending wisely and in the right place? Am I directing my teams to do the kind of work that is going to be needed? I think there's some hard questions to ask about ROI of time and money when it comes to triers, and I would encourage leaders to think deeply on that.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we really consider how are we focusing on our patrons as people, as relationships that we're in, and where each of those patrons is on their on the relationship curve as we are developing, getting to know each other, caring about each other, and how are we showing up? How are we communicating with them and using every opportunity to build that relationship over time?
Totally. And Stephen, I think this conversation about the business model that leaders operate, and to ensure that leaders really challenge their own thinking about how okay it is to have a business that relies so heavily on these inconsistent and expensive and non-renewable households. Like, do you know what your number is, and is it okay? I think we would say it's not the smartest way to operate these kind of businesses. It's just plain not.
Thank you, Jill, Brad, Christina. That's triers. On to buyers and advocates next. As you reflect on this episode, ask yourself, do we really know how many triers in our database return? And what are we doing intentionally to change that? Visit the link in the description below for more insights and resources, and join us as we move up the loyalty pyramid and talk about buyers in the next episode of Leading the Way.